You're listening to the Electrocast podcast. This is podcast number 15. On this installment of Electrocast, we chatted with Andy Lyon. Electronic musician, sound designer, blogger, and supporter of independent music, Andy records under the artist's name Andrulian and is preparing his next release due November 2015. Hello, everybody. Thanks for joining us for another session of Electrocasts. This is Jeff, and I'm here with Case, and we're very happy to have Andy Lyon on the show today. You may know Andy as someone who records under the name Andrulian, and we're really pleased to have him with us. How are you today, Andy?
Yeah, I'm great, thanks. How are you?
Oh, we're good. So, Andy, not only are you a musician, a composer, a sound designer, a noise texturalist, but you're also a writer. You have a pretty active blog, an Andrulian blog. Tell us a little bit about the blog before we start talking about music, if you don't mind. How'd that come about?
Yeah, it started a few years ago. I was kind of thinking that I'd like to get into blogging just so that I could kind of express a few sort of ideas. And I started with music theory and kind of thoughts about music just to get going. And I suppose it's fairly low key. Can imagine it's quite difficult kind of getting that sort of information read by anybody. And I think that's certainly a problem these days with blogs because there's so many. It's difficult kind of promoting it. And one day I thought, what can I do that's a bit different? So I started reviewing albums and singles, that kind of thing. And it's kind of grown pretty quickly from there. Started music software recently as well, just to kind of expand the horizons, if you like. But it's just, there's so much great music out there. Just quite happy to listen to it, review, and get the word out on the sort of great artists. I think like a lot of people don't really have enough time to do everything I'd like to do. So I do tend to miss quite a few, and I'm a bit slow with some others, unfortunately. But yeah, I try and fit in as much as I can.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think we're all like that. I know that I enjoy trying to check out a lot of the new releases and new music posted by our friends on Twitter. But then there's also a bunch of people that we encounter that we don't even really know yet, and we just find the music. So it's hard to get everybody, and we do miss things, without a doubt.
Yeah, I think that's just one of the things, isn't it? Certainly with social media, I think it's kind of like the double-edged sword in a way that you kind of make some really good connections and you can get a message out there. But there's so much that it's just impossible trying to do absolutely everything.
But what I like about your blog, Andy, is you write in detail. The detail of your writing is very attractive. So when you review an album, I really get a sense that I know more about the album rather than whether it's a good album or not, or interesting, or what kind of genre it is. I really get to see it through your eyes. And so you have a real knack for giving the amount of detail that really helps. You do that also meticulously for reviewing apps, plugins, and particularly the glitch machine plugins. Can you talk a little bit about that? You seem to have like quite an affinity for them.
Yeah, I think it was something that came out of, I suppose, out of the blue in a way, when I'd started using a couple of their free plugins that they have. I have Fracture and Hysteresis, which are the free ones. And I just really liked the sort of effects that they provided. And then once I started looking at some of their other ones, like Polygon, for instance, and Cataract, it just really clicked straight away. And I think it's because with a synthesizer, you tend obviously to model a sound, and a very, very good range of sound you can get from a lot of different sort of VSTs. But the thing with Polygon, because it's sample based, it kind of does things to samples that you can't do just by layering them in tracks, say, with the modulation and the kind of the LFO effects and the kind of that whole, I don't know, I kind of say they put some magic in there, and I'm not quite sure how they put it in, but it always sounds better than if you just have the four samples kind of layered. There's something else that you get from using Polygon, and it's kind of that really subtle sort of glitch effects you can get, or you can have complete extreme chaos, for want of a better word. So it gives you a whole range from just real subtle blending to a complete kind of all-out sort of manic.
And it also
glitch.
uses granulization, right? Granules, like little tiny bits of sound that it mangles, morphs, cuts, metallicizes. I think Polygon has a metallizer, or
it does. Yeah, it's got four sample slots, and the effects it's got on are the more unusual effects, like a ring mod, a metallizer, and a stutter effect. And part of what you can do with the sample, as well as playing it forwards, backwards, and looping it, you can granulate it. And that kind of gives you some really interesting effects, especially if you play it an octave or two lower than the desired sort of, or the original sampled frequency. And that completely opens up loads of sort of different options, certainly for like bass or contrasting sounds.
In the lower registers, you get very interesting artifacts happening that are sometimes very unpredictable. So you use that in some of your tracks, these sort of granular sounds, these sort of very percussive granular sounds.
I think it comes from some of the field recordings that I started using. And I think you kind of put me onto some of that to start with. Certainly remember reading some found sounds that you were using. And then through the Citizen Memories project, which if people don't know, it's a project that's run by a guy called Stuart from Oxford in England. And he basically does a lot of field recording of sounds pretty much around the world and kind of sound maps a city and then gets people to remix or reimagine the sound and recontribute that. And I think partly that's where a lot of that came from, because I kind of realised that when you're making sound in a synthesizer, obviously you can make a huge range of sounds. But those kind of found sounds or field recorded sounds are kind of just unique, and they're not the sorts of things that you can create in any software, I would have said. So once you've got that as a sound source, it then opens up all these other possibilities, certainly with like Polygon, for instance, to kind of either just leave it as it is or maybe mangle it a bit and have some of the artifacts coming in. I think sometimes with art as well, I think sometimes we kind of aim for perfection. Right. And if you you don't often have perfection, certainly in nature and certainly not in life. And I think sometimes those little imperfections just make things a bit more, I suppose, a bit more real, or a little bit more, whether emotive is the word. So I know sometimes when I've done an exercise, say, where I've used quite a theoretical approach and done a song using pretty strict theory, and it sounds really lifeless. You know, it hasn't got any sort of emotion, or it hasn't got any interest in it. And I think sometimes those sort of artifacts or those glitches just give a little bit of interest and kind of hold your attention as a listener.
Andy, did you use Polygon or any glitch machine tools on an unreleased piece that you're working on that you sent us to check out, CHL04? Did you use any of that software and any of that approach with the found sounds there?
Yeah, that's got Polygon in there. It has got some subtle processing as well. I try to remember which one that was, because there was a few other different ones. But yeah, certainly Polygon, and I think it was Hysteresis on that one, just to add a little bit of movement into the sound. I mean, that's an interesting one, because originally I had a title for that sort of EP with those tracks, but then I realised it didn't really fit what I'd done. And I think subconsciously I realised that I'd taken a different approach, in that I'd kind of recorded sounds. One was at a local park and one was at an abbey. And it was kind of thinking about the fact that these places originally were pretty grand. I mean, with the abbey, say, for instance, in the Middle Ages, it would have probably owned like half the local countryside, and it had a number of monks that lived there. And a monk's life was pretty tough back in those days. There's a lot of kneeling. It's not very comfortable. And obviously, when they were popular and in their height, then it would have been a really kind of, you'd have thought, a really popular and a busy place. Over time, that kind of fell away as people realised that the monk's life wasn't worthwhile or rewarding compared to what else you could be doing. And so it kind of fell into decay. And then the next sort of process is then that rise again, where certainly now, which is a few hundred years later, it's a country park and it's very popular. It gets lots of visitors and lots of people really enjoy going there. So it was more thinking about that cycle, I suppose, of like rise, fall, decay. And that's kind of true. And so the original title I thought was not quite right. So it's going to be retitled. But yeah, that piece, it's kind of like looking at the country park where that was recorded near a play park. It's like a children's play area. And I just recorded it on my phone, which I know is very hit and miss for field recording, because if you get any wind, it's pretty bad. But it was a really still day. So I got that recording, and it was just really trying to capture that kind of spirit of the place, if you like, from kind of what it was to where it is now. And that's why it's got kind of that field recording with people talking on it, and you can hear probably calling the children, and there's the birds. And I think one thing that it does really well with the birds is one of those artifacts in Polygon is the bird tweets.
Yes.
It kind of drops down.
Yes, I could hear that.
In sort of octaves, which I didn't realise it had done until afterwards. Obviously, when you record it, you've got a lot of delays and things running, so it kind of kicks in a little bit after. So yeah, and it's those sort of things that I think really give that interest to a sound.
So let's hear this. Let's hear this track now. We're here with Andy Lyon, Andrulian, and he's talking about how he's using found sounds and field recordings to create an atmosphere of rise, fall, decay within a bunch of different natural settings. This is CHL04 here on Electrocasts.
So, Andy, when I was listening to this song, it's very obvious when the field recordings come in because it's a real sudden change and the music changes too. I felt like I was an alien and I was in a spaceship and all of a sudden I was making a connection and I was seeing something and then it disappeared and it made me sad because I wanted to have the connection again, and then it came back and and there was all of the field recordings all of a sudden added a lot of interest, and I really was listening, and then it disappeared again, and it was kind of like being in a spaceship, making a connection sort of in intermittent ways, and then in between longing for it to come back again. Now you already told us you wanted to sort of reimagine with sound that space through time. So in a way, I guess you could look at it as a time traveler and sort of looking back and looking forward. Is that like a theme that comes back in a lot of your music? This sort of looking in and then looking from the outside and looking inside?
Yeah, I think it is. I don't think it's necessarily a conscious thing, but I think it is a reflection sometimes of that thought and that kind of changing sort of perspective almost, if you like. And I think it's one of those things that you kind of realize over time as you're sort of making music, that you kind of put in that sort of an angle on things. And I think, again, that probably partly comes back from sort of citizen memories, the project there where I've reimagined sounds, because you're kind of almost trying to imagine that place. I mean, you have a photo which you can walk from a lot of the time, but if you've never been to one of the cities, say, where Stuart's done his recording, you're kind of thinking, like, how can I make this into what I think that place is like, for instance? So, yeah, I think sometimes it's kind of putting that different perspective on the recording and the song, which kind of then you have to be a bit subtle, because if it changes completely in the middle, then it can sound a bit too, maybe not contrived is the right word, but it doesn't have that flow then. But just a subtle change every now and then just kind of gives that different perspective on a song. And
I think also, you know, you juxtapose synthesized sounds, if you will, artificial sounds, digital, discrete sounds, with analog, natural, real-world, continuous sounds. And so your work almost feels like a conversation between those two aspects of sound, the continuous versus the discrete.
Yeah, I think that's partly because when I started recording electronic music, it kind of was an accident, which sounds a bit mad to say, but basically I was always a guitarist, and I'd played for a long time as a guitarist. And I mean, back in the day, I had a 4-track recorder, and I was kind of not really anti-electronic, but I kind of wanted to do everything myself. So with an old 4-track, I would play bass on it. I'd play guitar. I'd sing very badly. And kind of, I hadn't played guitar for a long time. And I decided that I needed something to really try and play guitar again. So I thought I could get an app on my phone that I could record some basic drum patterns and maybe bass line and play along to it. And I thought that would be a good idea. So I got this particular app called Caustic, which initially was Android, and I think it's on iOS now and BlackBerry. And I kind of got it, and I played around with it and just absolutely loved it straight away. I think it's quite like Reason in the way that it works with sort of racks almost. And then you arrange the music into patterns, like 1, 2, 4 bars, for instance. And then you stick those patterns all together in the sequencer. So you create the song using a sequence of patterns. And as I started using it, I started making making songs with it. Initially with samples, pre-recorded samples. And then one of my friends at the time, a guy called Nick, who records under the name of Narelle, does a lot of progressive trance, progressive house music. And he was absolutely dead set on always creating his own sounds. And he said to me, you know, why are you using samples? Why don't you make your own sounds? So that kind of set me off on learning how to create sounds from scratch, because it was something I'd never really done. So I had a bit of a crash course with some of the Sound on Sound articles, which are very good at explaining sort of creating sound. So I kind of went, from scratch, like, oscillators and envelopes. I started with Caustic on my phone and got on quite well with that. But then I found I needed, I suppose, a bit more kind of control, and I got lured into that whole sort of VST scenario, because it's very good Caustic, but there's certain things you can't do. A lot of the VST effects you can't use in there. So I kind of moved into using sort of VSTs, certainly one called Charlatan, which I definitely have a lot of love for, if you like, because it's the one that I learned to kind of create sounds on. And it's one of these that you have to put a lot of effort in, but you get the rewards out of it. because I find some of the VSTs that are out there, the presets are pretty much the only sounds you can get out of them. And it seems very hard sometimes to actually create your own sound. So with something like Charlatan, if you put the effort in, you can certainly get the sound. So that kind of set me creating my own sounds. And then I suppose through that journey of evolution, I went through to the found sounds. And then with things like Polygon, for instance, it lets you blend those two different styles. So you might think they're completely different, but as a sound source, that's sort of, again, something I suppose that I had changed my opinion on over time, because I kind of shied away quite a lot from sample packs and the pre-recorded loop packs. And I kind of was a bit like with the old 4-track day. I was kind of dead set on creating all my own sounds. Yeah. But then over time, I kind of thought, well, actually, it's a sound source. So you can edit and manipulate it in certain ways. And why not? And so that's kind of when with the found sound, when I kind of, I suppose, found that uniqueness, if you like, that it's, it's a unique sound for that sort of particular time and moment. And then you can use that as an actual sound source and move on from there. And yeah, with Polygon, it does let you use samples, but still do some of the digital type effects, if that's the terminology I'd use. It lets you do a lot of the digital effects on those sort of analog found sound. So I think that's where that juxtaposition has come from, because it's just a natural evolution over time of kind of learning the basics of sound design and then using these found sounds in the same way, if you like.
But Andy, what you're describing is almost identical development that, and I think I can speak for Jeff as well, but certainly myself, have gone through, is from songwriting to song sculpting to sound sculpting, really. And that the fundamental interest is in creating sound. I had a conversation with one of my former bandmates in Holland about that what is music is situated, what you term to be music. And he felt very strongly that music is music and there was nothing to talk about. But what I hear you say is that you went on a journey from fundamentally thinking of yourself as a songwriter to a sound sculptor. And so Jeff got me interested in alchemy. Are you familiar with alchemy?
Yeah, vaguely, yeah.
And Iris?
Yeah.
So alchemy actually is now part of
Apple. Camel Audio sold to Apple.
Yeah, Camel Audio sold to Apple, and it's now in Logic Pro. But Iris was another one of those programs where you can take samples and you can then actually turn it into a MIDI instrument from the analog, and it can be controlled by MIDI. And so that is where I think that technology has allowed all three of us, and I think many people with us, to marry the found sounds with the synthesis. And I think you are a very clear example of somebody who has gone on a journey. I think we talked to Mark Ward. I think he's another person, in that sort of family, if you will. I was very intrigued by Lone Wayfarers, if I say it correctly.
Yeah.
And you published that on the Lurking Fear album on the Mobius Spin label.
Yeah, that's right.
And I found that a really interesting sort of, you talked earlier about the emotion. Can you, the emotion that you create in a song, can you talk a little bit about how you achieve that in Lone Wayfarers?
Yeah, I mean, that album came about through Polygon, effectively, where I put a few samples together, and it was quite a creepy sound. And it was one of those where I was kind of not sure if I really liked it, because as I listened back to it, it was kind of a bit difficult to listen to because it was kind of very creepy. And I got that association with H.P. Lovecraft pretty much straight away, and certainly the story that it's named after, this Lurking Fear. And I think with that, it just seemed to capture that sort of a feel of a place that's kind of a bit creepy, and obviously a lot of people have left and there's something happening that you're not really quite sure what it is. And obviously it all goes kind of wrong when it gets dark. So it was trying to capture that And on the one hand, I was quite wary of that because I know there's a lot of really kind of diehard H.P. Lovecraft fans that would probably say that is absolutely nothing like what he's trying to evoke in that story. And I think that sort of links into some of the visualization side of it, where you're trying to create that atmosphere so people can kind of get a feeling from listening to the song, in the same way that a writer, obviously when you read someone who's particularly good, you can always get an impression of kind of what's going on, and you make that picture yourself a lot of the time. Yes. And I think that's what I was trying to do with that, was just try and make that atmosphere that's a bit kind of creepy.
Right.
And a bit edgy, and try and make people kind of make their own conclusions, if you like, as to what's happening.
I think that's important, Andy. I like music that can be thematic. Like, you know, you had mentioned that every track on Lurking Fear is related to the Lovecraft story in some way, but you don't tell us what to feel. You leave it open. When we were talking about CHL04, you know, Case had envisioned a space traveler, you know, having connections broken. It sounded to me like I was trying to fall asleep, and then the field recordings would come in and wake me up, and those were thoughts buzzing in my head to kind of stir me awake, and then I'd go to sleep again, and then I'd wake up again when the recordings come back, you know? So we had two wildly different interpretations of the same thing, and I love that.
Yeah.
I love that. You give us the canvas to dream on, and that's really where it's at,
okay,
you know?
Thanks, yeah, and I think the approach with that album was different from what I'd done before, because in the past I'd done songs pretty much as singles and hadn't really thought of much in the way of continuity, for instance. So they were kind of discrete songs that were recorded as individual entities. And with Lurking Fear, I took a different approach where I kind of made all the sounds and got all the sounds together that I wanted and saved them as a file, and then used those sounds in each of the songs and kind of edited them slightly, put in slightly different sounds in some, and to keep that continuity of sounds. I guess maybe that was because, going back to that creating sound, I probably thought in the early days that I needed to have individual specific sounds for each particular song. But with that, it's more of a shift into creating that theme through the album. So it's got that kind of feel to it all the way through, but different sort of aspects of the same sort of emotions.
Nice.
Which, why don't we listen to Lone Wayfarers?
Okay. Yeah, I was going to say, hopefully I did manage that, and it certainly found from your comments, which are much appreciated, that certainly managing to get that sort of a feel.
Yes.
This is Lone Wayfarers, track from Andrulian's album Lurking Fear on Mobius Spin, and you hear it here on Electrocasts. Andy, how did you come about working with Martin on that release, Lurking Fear? How did you come to release it on Mobius Spin?
It was trying to remember the process. I suppose with Twitter, it's something that I find a bit one of those peculiar things that you can speak to somebody for quite a long time, never actually meet them, or kind of necessarily. I mean, I don't even know what Martin looks like, but I'd corresponded with Martin over a few different things, certainly with the reviews on the Mobius Spin, and I'd emailed him a few questions, and he's always been really very helpful. I think he's one of these people that is just very kind of generous with his advice and is very willing to help. You know, some people are quite guarded in terms of sort of some of the technical things and probably wouldn't really tell you much information, but certainly whenever I've gone to Martin with a question, he's always come back with some really useful answers. And I think it was after I'd done the Grand Central song, which I think is another one that will be played sort of a bit later. It was just the thought, and I just emailed him and said, I've got this album. Would you be interested in releasing it on Mobius Spin? And he was really delighted to do that. So I was obviously happy with that, because you never know sometimes with sort of work, and if it's kind of a certain direction that maybe somebody wants to sort of go in with their sort of publishing, certainly, if you're trying to create a bit of a niche or whatever. So I was absolutely delighted that Martin was really into it and published it on Mobius Spin.
Yeah, fantastic.
Well, besides you working with found sounds, natural sounds, and synthesized sounds, your work also is inspired by literature and by visual art. And so Grand Central is entirely made from a picture. How did you do that? So you use an actual picture to create this track?
Yeah, there's some software that's called Virtual ANS, which is based on it's certainly Russian in origin. And I think back in the 70s, I think there was a whole album that was produced just using this software. But it converts images into sound. Excuse me. And there's a few tricks you need to be a bit aware of in terms of the background colour. Because if you've got a white background, for instance, you can end up with a wall of sound, because everything that's white, it produces a sound, and everything that's black is silent. So you need really to kind of play about with the image to make sure you've got the right sort of contrast settings. And you load it in, and then it just creates a sound from the recording. It's something I did on a previous album, Means of Escape. There was a song on there called Roll Away the Dice.
Mm-hmm. That's one in two parts, right?
Yeah, that's right, yeah. And that was based on the story cubes, which are like dice with pictures on. And they're aimed at children, so you roll them and you can tell a story from the pictures.
Yes.
And I rolled the dice, and I got the pictures, and then edited it slightly, and I made some of the sounds in Virtual ANS. So yeah, you can create the sounds in this. I think it's free on Windows, actually.
And also available for the Mac.
And it's an Android app as well, so you can kind of do it on your phone as well. So it's a really good way of just experimenting and getting a different sort of sound that you would normally get from a different source. And then using certainly Cataract was used on that to make some sort of generative sort of rhythms, if you like. It kind of fed in through there and just kind of created that particular song.
And that was Martin's photograph.
Yeah, he did.
Was it in Grand Central?
I think it was, yeah. It was one that he posted on Twitter, and I saw it. And because I've been playing with the Virtual ANS recently for that previous album, I saw it, and I just saw the lines on the photo, and I just thought that would make a pretty interesting sound source to begin with. So that was the one that I used. It's on the SoundCloud sort of posting. That's the photo that he took. So
you actually when you see the picture, you already have a sense of what it might do sound-wise?
Yeah, I suppose sometimes you do, but then by the time you've processed and applied a few effects, sometimes it comes out different to sort of what you're anticipating. But it was just trying to see what would happen with the Virtual ANS to see what sort of sound that we got out of it, yeah.
After having used it for a while, you could probably predict a little bit about what you might hear based on the tones of the photograph. But probably the first time you did one, Andy, it was a complete, like, mind-blowing sort of thing, I can imagine.
Yeah, it was, because I hadn't appreciated the sort of the contrast and the fact that I pretty much ended up with just a kind of a wall of noise, basically. And then as you get used to it, you can edit and you can filter bits out.
Does it matter whether it's black or white or whether it's color? So is it a grayscale thing or is it an RGB thing?
It's more of a grayscale, I'd say. It seems to work better with black and white.
So then it really deals with contrast and intensity, right, of the pixels.
Yeah.
Neat.
Why don't we hear that? Do you want to hear that?
Yes, I do.
Case, did you want to say something before we hear it?
I wanted to say, let's go and listen to it. It is a fascinating track. It's really, really mind-boggling.
Yeah. Okay, so here, this one is not part of any album, correct, Andy? It's on SoundCloud kind of as an independent piece right now?
Yes, that's right.
Yeah. This is Grand Central, inspired by the photograph, using the ANS software that Andy was just speaking about. Here on Electrocast, Grand Central.
Now, a couple of weeks ago, we talked with Kim Ruger, and we talked about a project you and she did together, and that was a literature-based project. And we promised her that we would be talking about that with you. Can you talk a little bit about the choice of the piece of literature that you had asked her to read?
Yeah, it was. Again, it was a citizen and memories project, and the theme was water. And I'd listened to a few of the sounds to try and pick one that I really liked the sound of, and it was crashing waves on the beach, and it was a story by an author called Dion Fortune, the Sea Priestess, and it's ultimately kind of an occult sort of work, because she was quite a famous occult author and practitioner. But it's one of those works that when you read it, you just get a really good picture kind of what's going on. And it's kind of occult fiction, the best way to describe it. And it was just the fact that with the crashing waves, it just kind of really brought that sort of a feeling back, if you like. So it was a thought I could get that sort of basic sound going. And I did think, because it was a story with a female sort of lead character, it would sound a lot better if I had a female voice sort of doing the reading. And I'd spoken with Kim previously about the Cities and Memories project, and she said she'd not had much time to get involved. And I thought, well, actually, it'd be quite a good way to participate, because it's not like a whole entry, if you like. It's kind of a collaboration together. And it just went really well, because initially created a bit of a backing track, if you like, and it still needed a bit of something else, I thought. And that's when Kim did the piano over the top, which just suited it absolutely brilliantly. And so, considering we're obviously across the Atlantic, different sides, different time zones, sort of 4 or 5 hours different, completely different computer systems and music systems, it went incredibly well in terms of getting the sounds backwards and forwards and getting the work together and getting it sort of coherent and getting it finished off. So yeah, it was kind of one of those rare instances where something just works really well, and there's kind of no particular issues or no problems, no kind of software compatibility type issues, no time issues. I mean, the conversations were often a bit random in terms of late night, early morning, that kind of thing. There's a bit of a delay between responses, say. But yeah, I mean, it came together really well. But I think, again, that sort of work, it's something that over time I've kind of read a little bit of that kind of sort of occult fiction. And I think also there's an author, Robert Anton Wilson, who I came about a roundabout way through another author called John Higgs, who's a British author who wrote a book about a band called the KLF. I don't know if you're aware of the KLF that were on the go, I suppose, in the 80s. And yeah, and their big claim to fame, if you could call it that, was the fact they burnt £1 million. They made £1 million and burnt it. And the idea basically was that they realised that money was a bit of an evil, if you like. And the only way to take it out of circulation was to destroy it. And I think that book is a little bit about the KLF, but it's also a lot about music and a lot of the synchronicities that go on. And it's funny, really, because it does kind of link back to some other stuff that I'd read a long time ago. And it links in with a lot of other kind of authors, for instance, like sort of Robert Anton Wilson, who wrote a book called the Illuminatus trilogy, which is definitely not one for the faint-hearted. It is definitely a perspective changer if you read that. It's definitely it's interesting, and it certainly makes you think about things in a different way. And I think that's probably where a lot of the perspective comes from, if you like, where I've got this different sort of perspective. And I think something he said as well, because he says the map is not the territory. And what he means by that is, if you take your city, say, where you live, which obviously you know very well, and you have a map of it, you know where the streets are, you know where the schools are, you know where the churches are, you know where all of the main roads are, that kind of thing, the parks. But what you don't know is you don't know what the traffic sounds like, or what the birds sound like, if that park has no birds in it for some reason, or another park has a lot. And so I think that kind of is in my mind a lot of the time. And I think, again, that's one of those things where you talk about perspective and giving a different viewpoint. I think a lot of it comes back to this sort of the books that I've read, and they all have different viewpoints and different perspectives on things. And I think that kind of really comes through in the music, that it's sometimes you start off with one thing and then you kind of move slightly just to give it a kind of a what if, or just a slightly different angle on things.
So was that your attraction to the waves crashing on the shore, sort of in a repeated but not exactly the same way? I mean, each time a wave crashes, it's sort of like a white noise, right? It is, but it does it in a sort of regular way. In a track that you send us, Tech Explorations #2, which is going to be heard for the first time by the world when they listen to this podcast, I assume.
Yeah.
You use some watery sound, and I was absolutely blown away by that, because you managed to fit that in the rhythm with the techno drum, the bass kick. So the sort of seemingly random watery sounds were synced quite nicely with the drum. How did you do that?
That's a very good question, because it's one of those things I'm not exactly sure how it worked so well. think that that particular sort of work is from an album, I suppose I'd call it, I've been working on for a while, that uses a lot of the sample loops. I think I'd kind of pushed myself to make music with those sort of pre-recorded sample loops, like the sample packs that you can get. And I think the key that I've found with those is it's really mixing and matching, and it's getting sounds from a lot of different packs that fit together and seem to work really well. And the idea was to kind of have that tech house sort of a feel, but add a few contrasting elements in. And that water recording was from, there's a group, if you call it that, Thalamus Labs, and they released this huge sample pack, and it had a lot of field recordings. And that recording is from an iceberg, that sort of water sound. And I thought it wouldn't work, and it wouldn't work in terms of the sort of the syncing, and I thought it would just not sound very good. But once I put it in there, it just seemed to fit really well, just kind of as it was. And it just got that really good feeling with it.
So you were somewhat lucky with it.
Yeah, I think, yeah.
But because if you use these sort of random, like water, sort of puddling around, could be sort of a random sort of experience sound-wise. If you put that in the mix soft enough, it works, right? Because it's sort of like a watery noise that sort of fills the space. But you put it like quite up front, and then it has to sync somewhere. It doesn't have to sync everywhere, but it has to sync somewhere.
Yeah, and again, I think that comes back to this like perfection sort of thing, if you like, where if you tried to get that perfect, then you would never get it spot on, absolutely perfect. But because it's got that bit of movement and that bit of natural kind of sort of swaying, if you like, from the rhythm, it just kind of gives that interest in that.
Yes, it adds swing. It added swing to your piece, really. So.
Yeah, I really enjoyed this track a lot, Andy. I thought the sounds were great. I don't know what it is, but there's this sound that repeats. I think it's at the end of every 24 bars or at the beginning of every 24 bars. I don't know what it is, but it's almost like a rattling sound.
It's a granular sound.
I can't even describe it, but I love it. So you don't even know what the hell I'm talking about, but you're doing it. You're doing it. You're doing it for me with that sound, even if we don't know what to call it. So it's fantastic. How's that album going, Andy? You said that it's kind of a work in progress, and I want to hear more. So what's the plan for the techno experimental techno album?
It's one of those that I've had kind of in production for a little while, and I'd kind of shied away from releasing it. And I'm not really sure why. I think maybe because there was a lot of those sort of sampled sounds, if you like. And I'd kind of pushed myself to use them as sound sources and add other elements in. And I think as well, it was at the time I swapped over Doors from Ableton Live Lite, which is very good. But the problem with the light version is you've got a real limit on VSTs and tracks. And so, although I did that Means of Escape album using Live Lite, there was an awful lot of recording audio and then importing that into another track so that I could make the most of VSTs and the track limits. And you can do it. It's not easy, but you can do it. And then once I'd moved into MooLab, which is another door, and it had absolutely no limits whatsoever, that enabled me to open up a lot of the things like EQ, which I'm still trying to get my head around, to be perfectly honest. But
me too.
I think the art of a lot of music is EQ. But a lot of music production, EQ is like absolute paramount.
It certainly gives you a lot more scope, and I found that with those songs that I kind of abandoned, I thought, well, okay, I'll resurrect it, and I've kind of exported those into MooLab and applying EQ, and it certainly makes a huge difference to the sound. So it will be released. I'm not sure quite when, but there's another one I need to finish off that I did. I did a whole range from, I suppose, Ableton and MooLab, and also there's some that I did in Caustic as well, which is I keep using from time to time because I just find it's a really good way of getting an idea down really quickly, if nothing else, and you can export into a DAW. So it's quite a handy way of recording ideas. So yeah, I think it will be it will be released, but I haven't got a release date at the moment.
Really? Is there anything else you wanted to talk about before we ride out on Tech Explorations 2, Andy?
No, I mean, I think we've covered pretty much everything I was thinking of talking about. I mean, certainly in terms of I think the perspective thing is probably one of the main things. And I think certainly with the sort of the glitch sort of side of it and the sort of the polygon, I certainly encourage anyone who's curious to look into that sort of software and just have a play with it and see what happens, because it's such phenomenal kind of software. And I think as well, sometimes if people get kind of a bit stuck, I know sometimes I go through patches where I just cannot seem to kind of create anything. And I find that really sort of frustrating. I think sometimes using these sorts of effects, if you like, or different types of a sampler instrument for one, or even something like convolution reverb, where you effectively apply like the sound of the reverb to a different setting. Not explained that very well, have I? But you can basically put, like, say, a bouncing ball type of tail onto a synth sound, and all of a sudden you've got a completely new sort of sound that you haven't even thought about, or you wouldn't be able to kind of necessarily find. So I think sometimes those sorts of things are really useful to unblock you sort of, if you have a bit of a patch where you're really struggling, doing something sort of different, I think is a really useful tool. I know I use that quite a lot. Yeah.
Using new tools is always inspiring. It always gets you out of a rut, I think. Yeah, absolutely. So before we ride out on Tech Explorations 2, I want to thank Andy for being here with me and Case. And please do visit andrulianblog.wordpress.com to read all his album reviews. His reviews are so fantastic. You said a lot of great things about Nail from Isotherm. Thank you, Andy. And Case's laundry tapes you reviewed, I didn't even have to listen to it. I still haven't listened. I still haven't listened to it because you told me exactly what it was about. So I just heard it through you. So
you heard it through the grapevine.
But also do visit Andy's Bandcamp and SoundCloud pages. Andy's got 3 or 4 albums, I believe, out there on Bandcamp under on your page, Andy, and then there's one more on Mobius Spin. Yeah,
that's right. Yeah.
So thanks, Andy, for spending some time with us. Thank you, Case, and we are going to ride out on Andrulian's Tech Explorations number 2. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
groove laid out in rhythmic production.